Mic check, mic check, mic check, mic check. Hey, what's up, everybody? Or should I say, good morning, gamers? As I quote one of my favorite personalities in the gaming industry. We're here this afternoon. My name is Game Logic. If you haven't been around the channel, back for another episode. I would say back for another episode, but this is not back for another episode because this is the first time I've ever gone live to do anything like this. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about kind of the brand loyalty fallout that I'm seeing on the social media channels, especially on Twitter. This is not the thing I normally do. Normally I stick to news. Normally I don't talk about rumors, but a few things have kind of been burbling and I wanted to get a chance to get out there and talk about them. And so anyway, today the fallout continues as we continue to see more and more rumors pointed in the direction of Xbox releasing games on other platforms. Let me start off talking about vendor lock-in. And this is something that I've kind of talked about before, and it's to me it's a weird thing. It's partially a weird thing because I work in the technology industry, and we often go after business, and we also do a lot of consultancy, and so we often talk to businesses about avoiding the notion of going with a single technical solution, and finding themselves locked into it. So being wary of something like engaging in Oracle, right, which has a lot of kind of fee structures and things that cause you to kind of be entrenched once you're on that platform, or even when you go with some of the cloud service providers. And for a very long time, actually, I think Amazon just reversed this, but they will, I think Amazon, maybe it was Amazon, maybe it was Google that had a very kind of draconian pricing structure about if you wanted to leave their platform and the amount of money they would charge you to egress all of your data. Because, once you've invested in putting all of your data over on a Google platform, then getting it out so that you can take it to another platform, they would make that prohibitively expensive, so that I would encourage you to kind of sit tight in Google. And so, one of the things that kind of springs to my mind is, as I see a lot of people who are kind of dissatisfied with the Xbox brand about these rumors, is, well, in general, you shouldn't really follow consumer purchasing habits that lead you down the path of vendor lock-in. I often refer back to the story of, when I got my fourth or fifth Red Ring of Death, how, I traded, that final Xbox in and left the Xbox platform for 4 years. From 2010 until very early 2014, a little less than 4, maybe 3.5 years, because, despite however many games I'd bought or, whatever investments I'd made, I just wasn't particularly interested in continuing to siphon money right in the direction of Xbox when I had hardware that wasn't reliable and wouldn't allow me to really take advantage of all that ROI. It was better for me to sign that off as a sunk cost, right, and go off and do something else. So let's just kind of start there with an opener. One of my mutuals on social media, Everborn Saga, brought up this philosophical question, I think, earlier this week, where he asked for a comparison between, how sports fans behave versus how gaming brand loyalists behave. And the thing that occurred to me, and this is just a little bit of sort of what I think I see going on, is, sports fans behave the way they do ostensibly for camaraderie. It's because it's out of a hope that you're going to see that other fan at the stadium. You're going to go over to that other fan's house and kind of participate, in an afternoon of shared common experience and shared common loyalty and, shared hopes. It's not really because, and maybe at best, what's the monetary benefit to you? Maybe that person will invite you to their tailgater. Maybe that person will buy you a beer, right? Or when you go over to the house, they have a food spread, whatever, right? But it's not really out of this notion of a hope for exchange of goods. It's not because there's a hope that one sports fan is going to find you and then hope that you go out and find another 2 fans, and that those 2 fans are going to go out and find another 4 fans, and those 4 fans will find another 8 fans. You see where I'm going? And, we have these kind of cells of community fandom and brand loyalty that have grown up, and they eventually become this kind of Amway-like, Mary Kay-oriented kind of single-cell organism that's rife with a lot of groupthink, echo chambers, often speaks to a set of what seems like very scripted common talking points. There's a number of kind of chief Pied Pipers kind of in this hierarchical pyramid that, don't really give you information, but really try and tell you what you should believe. And the fact is that those people have often done that out of a hope that, people would subscribe to their Patreon, that people would subscribe to their channel, that people would give them likes on their YouTube videos, that people will watch their videos in hopes that, they would monetize off at least the advertising revenue that YouTube, sets up. Maybe a secondary hope is that, they would just find some other victims to spoon with in their 500 thread count sheets of victim mentality, right? To kind of curl up with and live their lives in, as a defensive shield against, the misery or the feeling of bullying that they seem to perceive that they experience online. One of the things, looping it back to vendor lock-in, so those are kind of the 2 forces that I feel like I see at play. Then you add the media to the swirl. And one of the things that sticks out in my mind is, I think like 8 years ago or so, I was listening to an Apple podcast, and I heard, these journalists, who talked about, and lots of us kind of fulfill these roles, right? In our circles, we're the person that people always come to ask, what cell phone should I buy? Or what TV should I buy? Or, what computer should I buy? And they were talking about, this common thing that happens with them about people coming to them and asking them what smartphone they should buy. And they kind of revealed and mentioned that, what they do when people come and say, hey, should I make the switch? iPhone's not really doing it for me. Should I switch to Android? And they were mentioning that they will typically advise people, hold on, pump the brakes. Maybe you don't want to do that because think about all the money that you've invested in apps. And again, it goes back to my feeling that that's like a thing that you shouldn't do because, again, you're preaching vendor lock-in. And I actually think from a journalistic perspective, it's a bit of a disservice that you would tell somebody that, in for a penny, in for a pound, that you've spent, so many number of years collecting apps for iOS, or you spent so many years in Game Pass, why would you jump ship and go to another console platform? The fact of the matter is that consumers should be given information that they need based on you eliciting from them what their requirements are. In terms of, gaming products, gaming consoles, you ask what kind of gamer they are. One of the threads you pull is you ask, do they even know? Because maybe if they don't know or they're not certain about what kind of gamer they are, maybe the recommendation you make, is a cost-conservative strategy. And so in that ways, recommending an Xbox or Game Pass makes sense. I often said, prior to the launch, for new customers, new gamers coming into the market who don't know what kind of gamer they are, that, it would make sense to just spend that initial money on an Xbox Series S and make it a Game Pass machine, right? Until you really figure out what your requirements are. Just like, if you're buying your first house, I don't necessarily recommend that you go off and you spend $500,000, $800,000 when you don't know what it is that you want. We have this term starter homes. Maybe you buy a starter home, right? Figure out what your requirements are, figure out the things that you like and you don't like, and then you go buy a bigger house. Much the same way as when it comes to motorcycles. I tell people don't go out and buy a 1000cc motorcycle right off the bat. Maybe buy a 600cc bike. See what you like, see what you don't like, and then go bigger. So we come back to the central theme again of how people have been misled by people who don't give them information, people who don't have a soundtrack, a voice track that encourages, hey, here's the information I'm giving you. Now, I would like you, I'm not telling you what to think. I want you to go use that as a platform to jump off of, to go find other information, and then come to your own conclusion. But instead, typically what these people do are kind of now having this brand loyalty fallout. And they're partially having this brand loyalty fallout because the things that they've told their listeners and their audience to believe over the last several years are now becoming untrue, potentially. Again, we are reacting to all of this out of rumor, right, and conjecture. But, those people didn't give them information and tell them to go draw their own conclusions. They give them the conclusions that people should already draw based on a cherry-picked set of information that they choose to present. They don't give you references. They don't give you URLs. They give you sound bites and talking points. We had this theme go around the gaming community this week talking about the citizen journalist. And what I'll say is, that's a notion that I kind of have loosely used. I've used the term hobbyist journalist, but it's a term that I've used and applied to myself for the last 23 years, since I started blogging in 2000, 2001. And I often told myself that the mission was to provide something that I felt was starting to slip away and that wasn't being provided in the journalist space. The job of a citizen journalist is to actually ascribe to an even higher ethos than that of the mainstream journalist. And the gaming media today, in the 2020s particularly, has definitely gone mainstream. They are not that much different than a Fox News or any type of network. And I don't use Fox News as I'm pointing out conservatism. It goes truthfully for any network that is liberal as well. It's news channels that are interested in pushing a message rather than reporting news. Newspapers and news journalists, I would say, the way that it should have been, even though there are people who will argue, written journalism was never like this, their mission ostensibly was to present information and not to lace that information with their own opinion and let people draw their own conclusions. Yes, it may have been contrived. They may have pointed you in a certain direction, but ostensibly that was still the objective. But the gaming media has gone decidedly mainstream, and they preach much more so narratives and pogroms, and in the same manner in which kind of YouTubers do as well. And so my perspective is that if you're going to be a citizen journalist, then you actually should ascribe to a higher ethos than that of the mainstream journalist who serves a corporate overlord and a publishing matriarch. Our standards should be even higher, because theoretically, we need to actually do it better than the so-called professionals who have the backing of a major media outlet. Theoretically. The overall quality in gaming journalism, especially today, over the last 23 years, has definitely gone downhill. The group of editors that I see and that I hear on podcasts today are less technically astute than they used to be. I remember in the early 2000s reading PC Gamer, under the leadership and management of Gary Whitta and later Greg Viderman, where I learned all about building PCs. But then, console magazines were also good about being technically astute, I felt, back then as well. Today, I listen to most gaming media podcasts, and I listen to the kids on them, and lots of them were recruited from some influencer base rather than out of an actual school of journalism. And they can't tell you the difference between a Vertex shader and an SSD. If you go too far outside Digital Foundry today, you're pretty much in a wasteland of technical assessment in the console space. And yet those are often the outlets that the gaming community relies on and repeats. And then you go right further out into kind of YouTube land and you get even worse. And it really gets bad because, again, the people who are less technically astute and are actually worse than mainstream gaming media make the insistence that they're right and that they know more when they're actually far wronger. Wronger? It's probably not a word. It's not a word. But, in general, the gaming community listens to a lot of journalism podcasters, for another instance, who have never managed a technical project, who have zero education or domain expertise in that space, or software development. And yet, a lot of these journalists are constantly writing articles about how a team of engineers should be led, never having done so themselves. And so the job of the citizen journalist should be to present information from multiple sources. When I write a blog post or when I do Talking About Games Solocast, I research every article I cover across at least 4 different sources. And then I add my own domain expertise in the mix from being a project manager in the technical space, from being a program manager for very large scale programs, for leading software development teams. But by and large, more importantly than that, what I typically try to do, at least, is encourage listeners to go seek more information. You should constantly hear, I believe, me say on the Basement Radio Arcade podcast, don't listen to us. Don't simply buy in and believe that we're right. Don't push the I believe button. Start with the information that we pass to you, and then go seek out additional information, and then draw your own conclusions. Citizen journalists should express what they think, not necessarily assert, particularly with gaslighting tactics and this, emphatic insistence that everyone should just think and insist and just not only think the way that they do, but also then insist that anyone who thinks differently is just inherently wrong, which is a very strange voice track to me. In the gaming community, we talk a lot about how your influencer, your chosen influencer, your podcaster should post their gamer score, post their trophy list. I'd actually propose that if your chosen podcaster, more importantly than their gamer score, their trophy list, if your chosen podcaster or influencer asserts that you should listen to them because they know more or because they have access, if your influencer tells people who disagrees with them to sit down, which is another just really weird thing that I've seen, that should probably set off your spidey sense. And that should fail your smell test. Because those people who theoretically are leaders of discourse, leaders of debate around, the amphitheater, right, should be encouraging people to be students of the industry. When I do this podcast or I do anything, right, creating any type of content, my objective is to start a conversation. I want other gamers who are in the space and are around me, who are shoulder to shoulder with me. When I've kind of, left Twitter or left the gaming community, it's often because I make comments about, I don't want those people to be my neighbors. I don't want those to be the consumers that I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with. I want gamers who think for themselves and challenge pre-canned notions. I don't want gamers who are a bunch of lemmings and walk right off the cliff. In the gaming community, I would propose that we should have camaraderie out of a shared love for creative works and maybe spend less time yelling, screaming, foaming at the mouth, slobbering all over themselves about the things that they hate. George R.R. Martin wrote about that this week. And so again, this is me coming back to this notion of brand loyalty where there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth now, again, because, the Pied Pipers who led people down a certain path told people to sit down, told them that, anybody who complained about the way things were going, that they were just concern trolling, yelled and screamed loudly at them in an effort to suppress information. So again, going back to that topic, let me also talk about a few of the new narratives that are being written today as this brand loyalty thing spools around the community. One of them is that console revenue is at zero growth. So, my pushback on that is it's not zero, right? Anytime, especially as an engineer, anytime you express or come out your mouth with, no one said that, I'm going to point out to you that no one didn't not say that. I think that's a quadruple negative, but I'll point out, no, people said that, right? And people saw it. Revenue growth for the console industry is not zero. It's not zero because revenue has been growing up. And before you get, all spooled up, let me say I'm the first person to tell you stop the, record revenue, record profits, statement that kind of runs around by, again, mostly people who are not actually trained in reading balance sheets, SEC filings, and doing financial analysis, because record revenue is not nearly the end of the tail. There are other financial metrics that we look at, lots of calculations that we go through to actually, determine the trend of the financial health of a company. But just as a linear topic, right? Revenue in the industry has been growing over the last 20 years, the last couple of decades. It's not because the people who were buying games in 2005 are spending like double, triple the money now in 2023. There's a little bit of that. Sure, they're selling more, but it's because new gamers are entering the industry and are doing so every day. So we can have a talk about, maybe profit margins aren't as high, certainly. But regardless of how small the growth is, the gaming industry and the console sector, the console segment of the industry has been growing. It's been getting challenged, definitely by mobile gaming. Absolutely, certainly. There have been deflations, right? Particularly when you look at, how high things went during the pandemic and where they're coming down now. There's a market correction that's occurring. But I don't know that mathematically we really have proof of this notion that there's zero growth in the console industry. And that's a narrative that's starting now because people are trying to justify the rumors that they're hearing about Xbox. More so, that has bled into the second narrative, which is that, hey, everyone's going to go software-centric. Everybody's going to start just selling their games on other platforms. Microsoft is ahead. They're outthinking the competition. Maybe that's true, but I think the more grounded reality is that, first of all, this has been the Xbox strategy for a long time because it's the Microsoft strategy for a very long time. Because if you've been around senior levels of leadership and you've participated in corporate leadership or government leadership or anything, you'll know that one of the mantras of rising up through the ranks is that the entire time that you are a program manager, a project manager, a systems engineering lead, second in command, a platoon leader, whatever, you're not necessarily executing your mission. You are the steward and the caretaker for your boss's execution. And as you go from boss to boss, there's a certain level of malleability that you will need to have. Partially because every boss is going to be good at different things. You go to the writings of Tim Cook, right? And the quotes of Tim Cook. And he says the way he became such a great chief operating officer is that he felt that it was his job, his duty, to be good at the things that Steve Jobs wasn't. There was no need for him to become an expert at the things that Steve already covered. And so as you go around, one of the things that you're going to need to do is you are going to need to understand your boss's strategy because they're going to be different. Steve Ballmer's strategy was different than Satya Nadella's strategy. But if your intention is to be successful within the Microsoft Corporation, you will need to adhere to Satya Nadella's strategy. And Satya has been saying for an incredibly long time, since he took over as CEO in 2014, since he put Windows Phone to bed, that his priority is that he wants his software to be where the users are. And if that is not on Microsoft hardware, then he's fine with that. Microsoft is a software company. And so, again, if you follow that breadcrumb trail, then it naturally leads you to the understanding of why Xbox would be focused, potentially, on putting their games on other platforms. Because if you're not selling a lot of hardware, and your hardware is 9% of the console install base, then it doesn't really necessarily make financial sense, mathematical sense to hyper-focus on putting your games on your own hardware when they are such a small percentage of the market. It maybe then makes sense to take your software and put it where the users are, and the vast majority of users in the console market today are on Nintendo and on PlayStation. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Nintendo and PlayStation are doing a bad thing. They're playing to their strengths. One of the things that I mentioned on Twitter today is maybe you can want to argue that Microsoft is out ahead or Microsoft is doing a good thing or a better thing. But what I often talk about is corporations make strategic decisions often based on scale and often based on their targets and objectives. Many, many, many times, particularly technology companies, will get into a business where they will say, our objective is not to become the market leader. Our objective is not to lock down and put a stranglehold on the entire market. Our objective is not necessarily to become the number one vendor of a thing. Sometimes they want a boutique customer. Sometimes they want the luxury customer, the high-end customer. Ferrari's objective is clearly and obviously not to flood the market with tons of Ferraris, right? They want a certain type of customer, a certain type of consumer. I would even say Netflix's objective is not to become the number one, necessarily person, not inorganically or not out of, we often talk about kind of these, maligned ways of approaching growth. And one of those things you don't do is you don't go after growth just for the sake of growth. You go after growth intelligently and smartly. And so it may very well be, in the case of a Nintendo or a Sony objective, that the objectives that they're pursuing are the objectives that make sense to them for scale, because they're not a multi-trillion-dollar company. They cannot bear as much cost. It doesn't necessarily make as much sense for them to take their software and peanut butter it around every type of electronic appliance until the point where you can play Left 4 Dead I'm sorry, Left 4 Dead, The Last of Us Part 2 on a Samsung refrigerator, right? That doesn't make sense for them necessarily. And so I think, the market, this market in particular, like many other markets, has segmentation and stratification, and that's good. It allows people to compete at different levels. It allows people to run the ladder. And I think that's okay. And therefore, there doesn't need to be these narratives to justify what Xbox is doing in a manner that asserts that it is therefore definitively the superior vector by which you should pursue competition in the gaming market. How about we just let companies do the things that are good for them? We also talk about core competencies in corporate leadership and technical leadership. Let these companies perform based on what their core competencies are, and stop, again, leading people down. Because again, the whole point of these narratives is to, again, start Pied Pipering and start leading people down a path that allows them to feel warm and fuzzy, and again, spoon with people in their victim blankets, right? You should not need anybody to reinforce or make anything up, quite frankly, for you to feel good about money that you are making choices as an adult to go spend, right? If you're an Eagles fan, because you live in Philly, right, or wherever you live, maybe then you need somebody to tell you why you should be an Eagles fan, right? But these are consumer electronics. You don't need those politics, right, in order to feel good and comfortable about your electronics purchase. So at any rate, today, what Xbox is doing, if they're following these rumors, and again, we're talking about rumors, there are lots of reasons why that makes sense for them. They're the number 2 cloud provider on the planet. They can leverage a lot of adjacencies and strengths, and it makes sense to go after this. One of the things I posted on Twitter is I posted an interview from Sarah Bond back in 2022, actually before they announced the merger, where a lot of the things that I've been talking about since late 2022, she literally said them verbatim. That was an interview that I hadn't read until today, because I was kind of looking more into her background now that she's really ostensibly the leader of Xbox. So, again, the things that they're doing, if they're doing this if they are making these moves, makes sense for them. We don't necessarily need to bandy about it as if it makes sense for everyone else, and everyone else who's not doing what Xbox is doing is somehow inextricably behind. It's just a narrative that just kind of doesn't make sense. But in that thread on Twitter, I also wrote a lot about, compute and, hybrid compute and where the platform's going. But combining this topic and the previous narrative about, the console space being at zero growth, nobody's really about to just, the console industry isn't about to just come to a screeching halt. And because Xbox is putting things on multiple platforms, people are just going to stop buying consoles. That doesn't make any sense, right? We see tons of growth around handheld gaming right now, which really sets up Nintendo very well if they're going to deploy a platform that is actually more powerful than the Nintendo Switch. I have 2 Steam Decks, right? And what I found over the last few months of having those Steam Decks and, my 2 Nintendo Switches is that it still makes sense for me to own a Nintendo Switch. It's more comfortable, it's lighter, it's easier to pack. There are certain things it can't do, but there are also things that the Steam Deck doesn't do. And one of those things are the things that I just mentioned. It's not super comfortable ergonomics, right? Or weight carry. So again, there's space, there's segmentation, there's stratification, and we should just let these companies play on the different soccer fields that they play on. So we go back to, why are fans disappointed? Mainly it's because they did this to themselves. They overhyped a brand and a platform. They raised people up as heroes, like Lulu Chang Messervy, who I quoted at the opening of this podcast. Good morning, gamers. And Lulu took the bag and bounced and hasn't said 5 words to those fans since the Good Morning Gamers the day after the acquisition closed, until she was finally leaving Xbox. Don't feel too bad about it. We do this about games too. I constantly advise people, even my own co-host Brap, about overhyping games, about pumping up AAA games. We've definitely, in my opinion, overhyped Power World, to the point where there was a narrative running around that the developers had made their money and they were good, they were Gucci, and then all of a sudden this weekend it came out that their server costs right now are $500K a month, and that's not over. Right? There's information going around that that's out there that Fortnite server costs back in 2018 were somewhere between $600K and $3 million, depending on user float, right, during any monthly cloud spend. So if Palworld's going to be a thing, they're going to have increasing costs, and those costs are going to need content. And lo and behold, I spent 10 seconds Googling, and I found quotes from the Ark Survival team that said the exact same thing back in 2018. That what that game was relying on was player engagement, which encourages more players to onboard, which is what helps them drive revenue. We had a narrative running around that, oh, Palworld's good. Like they sell their game, right? They're done, you know? I'm like, no, it's a live service game. Stop trying to tell me to not compare it to every other live service game, because it has the same financial dynamics. But at any rate, like I said, don't feel bad because we overhype games. It makes sense that maybe there are people out there like you who overhype the platform, and now you're disappointed because there were things that you said or things that you bought into or things that you believed that are now ostensibly, potentially, on the eve of not being true. But that should also be okay, because one of the things that you mentioned was that Xbox had the right strategy by putting their games on other platforms. That was part of the big support of the acquisition, that Call of Duty was going to be peanut buttered around more games for more people. Now that that's happening, it's kind of weird that people are disappointed in it, because the very thing that you campaigned and pom-pommed and cheerleaded for is now ostensibly coming true. You would think that you would be okay. At any rate, if you listen to those pundits and you're angsty about the things that I've said today, well, maybe that's good. Maybe it causes you to shift around in your seat. Maybe having somebody poke their finger in your chest, put their thumb in your eye, will make you think about something differently and introspect and maybe reconsider how we proceed forward from here. If you don't agree with what I said, that's okay too. You can take the perspective that I've professed. You can go out and do your own research, gather your own numbers, run your own math, and then make up your own mind. But if you do that, of course, that was the central thesis of this take in the first place. Until next time, take care of yourself. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like. Come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube, as well as one of the co-hosts on the Basement Radio Arcade podcast on the Brat Podcast channel on YouTube. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.